The dust-choked town of Tombstone Creek had seen its share of darkness, but nothing quite like the auction block that stood in the center of Main Street on that scorching August afternoon of 1873. Sheriff Thomas Brennan adjusted his worn leather holster as he approached the crowd, his weathered face grim with purpose. The auctioneer's voice cut through the desert air like a rusty blade, selling human souls to the highest bidder. Among the unfortunate souls standing on that wooden platform were two figures that would haunt Brennan's conscience forever. The Yazzie sisters, towering Navajo women whose dignified silence spoke louder than any protest. What the sheriff couldn't know was that saving these women would unleash a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of everything he believed about justice, loyalty, and the price of freedom in the unforgiving American frontier. The taller sister, Ayanna, stood nearly 6 feet in height, her obsidian eyes scanning the jeering crowd with a mixture of contempt and calculation. Beside her, Najoni matched her sister's imposing stature, her copper skin bearing the scars of recent hardship, but her spine remaining unbent. Their previous owner, a cattle baron named Ezra Blackwood, had died under mysterious circumstances just 2 weeks prior, leaving debts that his estate couldn't cover. The territorial government had seized his assets, including what they callously referred to as his property, a practice that made Brennan's stomach turn despite its legal standing in Arizona territory. The bidding started at $50 for both women, a price that seemed to mock their humanity. Grizzled miners, wealthy ranchers, and traveling merchants called out increasingly higher amounts while Brennan watched in growing disgust. He had seen enough injustice in his 37 years to fill several lifetimes, from his days fighting in the Civil War to his current role maintaining order in this lawless corner of the world. But something about these two sisters stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt since losing his own family to Comanche raiders 15 years earlier. When the bidding reached $250, offered by a notorious brothel owner from Phoenix, Brennan stepped forward. His voice carried across the square with the authority of his badge. $300. The crowd turned to stare at the sheriff, confusion rippling through their ranks. Why would a lawman bid on slaves when he could have requisitioned them for official duties? The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man named Cornelius Pike, raised his eyebrows but continued the proceedings. No one dared bid against the sheriff, partly out of respect for his position and partly because everyone knew Thomas Brennan was not a man to cross lightly. As the gavel fell and the crowd began to disperse, Brennan approached the sisters. Up close, their imposing presence was even more striking. Ayanna's eyes held depths of ancient wisdom mixed with barely contained fury, while Najoni's gaze seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. "I'm Sheriff Brennan," he said quietly, "and you're free to go." The words hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Neither sister moved or spoke for a long moment, their faces showing no emotion that might reveal their thoughts. Finally, Ayanna spoke, her English heavily accented but clear. "You purchased us, Sheriff. We belong to you now." Her words carried no gratitude, no relief, only a simple statement of what she perceived as fact. Brennan shook his head firmly. "No, you belong to yourselves. I bought you to set you free." But Najoni stepped forward, her massive frame casting a shadow over the sheriff despite his own considerable height of 6 feet 2 inches. "Our people have a code, Sheriff Brennan. You saved our lives when death seemed certain. We are bound to you now, whether you accept it or not." The sheriff found himself in an impossible situation. These women, who should have been grateful for their freedom, instead insisted on a form of indentured servitude that he never wanted or requested. His attempts to convince them otherwise fell on deaf ears, and eventually, he reluctantly agreed to let them stay at his ranch outside town. Temporarily, he insisted, until they could find their way back to their people or establish themselves independently. What Brennan didn't realize was that the Yazzie sisters had their own agenda, one that went far beyond simple gratitude or cultural obligation. During their time with Ezra Blackwood, they had learned things about the powerful men who controlled the territory's secrets that could topple governments and destroy reputations. Blackwood's death had not been the natural passing that everyone assumed, and the sisters knew exactly who had administered the poison that killed him. More importantly, they knew why. The first sign that something was amiss came 3 days after the auction. Brennan returned to his ranch to find his modest two-room cabin transformed into something resembling a fortress. The sisters had somehow acquired rifles, ammunition, and supplies without his knowledge or permission. When he questioned them about it, Ayanna simply replied, "We are preparing for what is coming, Sheriff. You will understand soon enough." Her cryptic words sent a chill down his spine, but before he could press for more information, riders appeared on the horizon. The men who approached the ranch were not ordinary cowboys or drifters. They rode with military precision, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their weapons at the ready. Leading them was a figure Brennan recognized all too well, Deputy Marshal William Corcoran, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him throughout the territory. Corcoran had arrived in Arizona 6 months earlier, claiming to represent federal interests in bringing order to the lawless region. But Brennan had always suspected there was more to the man's mission than simple law enforcement. As the riders surrounded the cabin, Corcoran called out, "Sheriff Brennan, we're here for the Indian women. Hand them over, and nobody needs to get hurt." The demand confirmed Brennan's worst suspicions. This wasn't about law enforcement or territorial authority. This was personal, and somehow the Yazzie sisters were at the center of it. Without hesitation, he stepped out onto his porch, his hand resting on his gun. "These women are under my protection, Marshal. You'll need a warrant to take them anywhere." Corcoran's laugh was cold and mirthless. "I don't need a warrant for savages, Sheriff. Step aside, or be moved aside." The threat hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Brennan could feel the tension building, knowing that violence was inevitable. But before he could respond, the cabin door opened behind him, and both sisters emerged. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their newly acquired rifles held with professional competence. Najoni's voice carried across the dusty yard, "Marshal Corcoran, you should have stayed in Denver." The use of his name and the reference to Denver shocked both Brennan and Corcoran himself. How could these women, recently freed slaves from a remote ranch, know details about the Marshal's past? Corcoran's face paled beneath his bandana, and his hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. But Ayanna was already speaking, her words dropping like stones into still water. "We know about the silver mine, Marshal. We know about the forged papers and the murdered surveyors. Most importantly, we know about Senator Morrison's involvement." The mention of Senator Morrison sent visible shockwaves through the group of riders. Morrison was one of the most powerful political figures in the territory, a man whose influence reached from Arizona all the way back to Washington, D.C. If these women had information that could implicate him in criminal activities, they represented a threat that went far beyond local law enforcement. Brennan began to understand that he had stepped into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue of enslaved individuals. Corcoran's facade of official authority crumbled as he drew his weapon. "Those women know too much to live, Sheriff. Either you step aside, or you die with them." But as he spoke, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the desert. More riders were coming, and from the cloud of dust they raised, there were many of them. Brennan squinted against the setting sun, trying to identify the newcomers. Were they reinforcements for Corcoran? Or was this yet another complication in an already impossible situation? The approaching riders turned out to be a war party of Navajo warriors, led by an imposing figure wearing traditional dress mixed with modern weapons. As they drew closer, Brennan could see the family resemblance between the warrior leader and the Yazzie sisters. The man's presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation, and both sisters seemed to relax slightly for the first time since Brennan had met them. Ayanna called out in their native language, and the warrior responded with what sounded like relief mixed with anger. The warrior chief, who introduced himself as Joseph Yazzie, spoke to Brennan in perfect English. "Sheriff, my daughters tell me you purchased their freedom and showed them kindness. For this, our family is in your debt. But they also tell me that powerful men seek to silence them permanently." His eyes moved to Corcoran and his men with unmistakable hostility. "These men have already killed many of our people to hide their crimes. They will not harm my daughters while I draw breath." Corcoran found himself outnumbered and outgunned. facing not only the sheriff and the sisters but an entire war party of skilled fighters. His carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, and desperation began to show in his voice. "This is federal business, Chief. These women have information that threatens territorial security." But Joseph Yazie's response was swift and final. Then perhaps territorial security should not be built on murder and theft. The standoff continued as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Brennan realized that he was witnessing something far more significant than a simple confrontation between law enforcement and fugitives. The corruption that Corcoran and his associates represented went to the very heart of how the territory was governed, and the Yazzie sisters possessed evidence that could expose it all. But with powerful men like Senator Morrison involved, simply revealing the truth might not be enough to ensure justice. As if reading his thoughts, Ayanna approached Brennan and spoke quietly. "Sheriff, what we know could destroy many powerful men, but it could also get us all killed. Ezra Blackwood tried to expose them, and they poisoned him for it. We took his evidence before his death, but we need someone with authority and integrity to help us bring it to light." The weight of responsibility settled on Brennan's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had never asked to be a hero, but circumstances seemed to be forcing the role upon him. The evidence that the sisters had salvaged from Blackwood's ranch was extensive and damning. Forged land grants, falsified mining claims, records of bribes paid to territorial officials, and most shocking of all, a ledger detailing payments made to Comanche raiders for attacks on specific Navajo settlements. The conspiracy was vast, involving not only Senator Morrison but several other prominent political figures and business leaders. They had systematically stolen Native American land, murdered anyone who opposed them, and used their positions of authority to cover their crimes. Corcoran seemed to sense that his position was becoming increasingly untenable. His men were growing nervous, glancing at the Navajo warriors who surrounded them with professional competence. The marshal made one final desperate play, calling out to Brennan, "Sheriff, you don't understand what you're dealing with. These people will kill you the moment you're no longer useful to them. Join us, and you'll be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. Oppose us, and you'll share Blackwood's fate." But Brennan had heard enough. His response came not in words but in action. As he drew his weapon and aimed it directly at Corcoran, "Marshal, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government." The simple declaration seemed to echo across the desert like a gunshot. Corcoran's face twisted with rage and fear as he realized that his carefully constructed authority was meaningless against a sheriff who refused to be corrupted. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Corcoran's men, realizing that they were surrounded and outnumbered, attempted to fight their way out. The Navajo warriors, led by Joseph Yazzie, demonstrated the fighting skills that had made them legendary throughout the Southwest. The sisters, despite their recent ordeal, proved to be formidable opponents, their marksmanship precise and deadly. When the smoke cleared, Corcoran and 3 of his men lay dead in the dust, while the remaining riders fled toward the horizon. In the aftermath of the battle, Brennan found himself facing a new set of challenges. The evidence against Senator Morrison and his associates was compelling, but presenting it to territorial authorities would be dangerous. Too many officials were either complicit in the corruption or too intimidated to act against such powerful figures. The sheriff needed to find a way to expose the conspiracy that would ensure justice while protecting those who had risked everything to reveal the truth. Joseph Yazzie offered a solution that Brennan hadn't considered. "Sheriff, there are federal investigators in Santa Fe who have been trying to build a case against territorial corruption for months. If we can get this evidence to them safely, they have the authority and protection to act on it." The plan was dangerous. Santa Fe was over 300 miles away, and the journey would take them through territory controlled by Morrison's allies. But it seemed to be their only chance for real justice. The journey to Santa Fe became an epic chase across the American Southwest. Morrison's forces, alerted by Corcoran's surviving men, mobilized every resource at their disposal to prevent the evidence from reaching federal authorities. Bounty hunters, corrupt lawmen, and hired gunfighters pursued Brennan and his unlikely allies across deserts, through mountain passes, and into hidden canyons where the Navajo knew ancient trails invisible to outsiders. Along the way, Brennan learned more about the Yazzie sisters and their remarkable story. They had been captured during a raid on their village 2 years earlier, sold into slavery, and eventually purchased by Blackwood. But rather than being broken by their ordeal, they had used their position to gather intelligence about their captors' criminal activities. They had been planning their own revenge when Brennan's intervention gave them an unexpected opportunity for something greater: true justice for all the victims of Morrison's conspiracy. The final confrontation came at the territorial capital in Santa Fe, where Morrison himself had arrived with a small army of supporters to prevent the evidence from being delivered. But federal investigators, alerted by telegraphs sent ahead by friendly contacts, were waiting with their own protection. The corrupt senator found himself facing not only exposure but immediate arrest on federal charges that would end his political career and likely result in execution for treason. As Morrison was led away in chains, he turned to Brennan with undisguised hatred. "You have no idea what you've unleashed, Sheriff. There are forces at work here that go far beyond territorial politics. This won't end with my arrest." His words proved prophetic, as the exposure of the conspiracy revealed connections to corrupt officials throughout the Western Territories and even back to Washington, D.C. The case would eventually contribute to major reforms in how territorial governments operated and how Native American rights were protected. In the end, the Yazzie sisters' declaration that they belonged to Brennan forever took on a meaning that none of them had initially understood. They had become partners in a fight for justice that transcended the simple relationship between freed slaves and their liberator. Joseph Yazzie offered Brennan a permanent place among his people, recognizing the sheriff as a man of honor who had risked everything for the truth. But Brennan chose to remain in his role as sheriff, working to implement the reforms that the Morrison case had made possible. The sisters established a ranch near Tombstone Creek, becoming successful businesswomen who used their wealth and influence to help other Native Americans navigate the complex legal and social challenges of territorial life. They never married, dedicating themselves instead to ensuring that the sacrifices made during their fight against corruption would lead to lasting positive change. Their bond with Sheriff Brennan remained strong throughout their lives, a friendship forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. Years later, when writers and historians would ask Brennan about the case that made his reputation, he would always emphasize that the real heroes were the Yazzie sisters. Their courage in gathering evidence, their determination to see justice done, and their willingness to risk everything for the truth had been the driving force behind the entire investigation. The sheriff had simply been fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time to help them achieve their goals. The legacy of that hot August day in 1873 would resonate throughout the American Southwest for generations. The reforms implemented after Morrison's conviction helped establish legal protections for Native Americans that wouldn't be fully realized until decades later. The corruption that had seemed so entrenched and untouchable proved vulnerable when confronted by individuals willing to sacrifice everything for justice. And in the dusty archives of territorial records, the purchase receipt showing that Sheriff Thomas Brennan paid $300 for the freedom of 2 Navajo women would stand as a testament to the power of individual conscience in the face of systematic oppression. The tale of the giant Navajo sisters and the sheriff who freed them became legend in the American West, though the full truth of their story wouldn't be revealed until long after all the participants had passed away. In their own time, they were simply people trying to do what was right in a world that seemed determined to reward corruption and punish honesty. Their success in exposing the Morrison conspiracy proved that even in the darkest corners of the frontier, justice could still triumph when ordinary people found the courage to stand up for what they believed was right. The years that followed the Morrison conspiracy's exposure transformed the American Southwest in ways that few could have anticipated. Sheriff Thomas Brennan continued his duties in Tombstone Creek, but his reputation had spread far beyond the dusty borders of Arizona Territory. Federal marshals and territorial governors sought his counsel on matters of corruption and justice, recognizing him as a man who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or swayed from his principles. Yet despite the accolades and opportunities for advancement that came his way, Brennan remained committed to the small community that had become his home. The Yazzie Sisters Ranch, which they named Freedom's Promise, became a beacon of hope for displaced Native Americans throughout the region. Ayana's gift for negotiation and legal matters, combined with Najone's shrewd business sense, created an enterprise that not only thrived financially but served as a sanctuary for those seeking refuge from the ongoing conflicts between settlers and tribal communities. They established schools where Native children could learn both traditional ways and the skills needed to navigate an increasingly complex world dominated by American law and customs. Joseph Yazzie, their father, lived to see his daughters become respected leaders in their own right. Before his death in 1889, he witnessed the establishment of formal treaties that recognized Navajo sovereignty over significant portions of their ancestral lands, agreements that might never have been possible without the exposure of the systematic theft and murder that the Morrison conspiracy had perpetrated. His final words to Sheriff Brennan, delivered during their last meeting, carried the weight of a father's gratitude and a warrior's respect. "You gave my daughters back their lives, Sheriff. In doing so, you gave our people back their future." As the 19th century drew to a close, the American frontier was rapidly disappearing. Railroads connected distant territories. Telegraph lines carried news across vast distances in minutes rather than weeks. And the wild lawlessness that had characterized places like Tombstone Creek was giving way to more structured forms of civilization. Brennan watched these changes with mixed feelings, understanding their necessity while mourning the passing of an era when a single individual's courage could still change the course of history. The three unlikely allies maintained their friendship throughout the decades, though their paths diverged as circumstances required. Brennan married a schoolteacher named Margaret Sullivan in 1878, and together they raised 4 children who grew up hearing stories of their father's legendary encounter with the giant Navajo sisters. The children often visited the Yazzie Ranch, learning to speak both English and Navajo fluently, growing up with an understanding of cultural complexity that was rare for their generation. Ayanna never married, dedicating her life to legal advocacy for Native American rights. She became one of the first Native women to argue cases before territorial courts, using her imposing physical presence and sharp intellect to secure victories that established important precedents for future generations. Her legal briefs, written in perfect English but informed by traditional Navajo concepts of justice, became required reading for law students studying the intersection of tribal and American legal systems. Najoni chose a different path, focusing on economic development and business innovation. She established trading relationships that stretched from Mexico to Canada, creating economic opportunities for Native communities that had previously been excluded from legitimate commerce. Her success challenged stereotypes about Native American business acumen while providing practical pathways for tribal economic independence. By the 1890s, she was one of the wealthiest individuals in the territory, regardless of race or gender. The evidence that had brought down Senator Morrison continued to yield revelations for years after his execution. Federal investigators discovered connections to corrupt officials in Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and even California, leading to what historians would later call the Great Western Cleanup of the 1870s and 1880s. The systematic nature of the corruption shocked even seasoned politicians, revealing how thoroughly criminal elements had penetrated territorial governments throughout the region. Morrison himself died unrepentant, refusing to reveal the names of his co-conspirators even when offered reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. His final statement before execution was a bitter prediction that corruption would inevitably return, that men like Brennan and the Yazzie sisters represented an idealistic anomaly in a world fundamentally driven by greed and power. Time would prove him both wrong and tragically prophetic, as future generations would face their own struggles against institutional corruption and injustice. In 1901, as Arizona prepared for statehood, Sheriff Brennan received an unexpected visitor at his ranch. An elderly Navajo woman, bent with age but still carrying herself with dignity, approached his door accompanied by several younger tribal members. She introduced herself as the grandmother of the Yazzie sisters, a woman whose own mother had witnessed the first European explorers entering Navajo territory centuries earlier. Her purpose was to perform a ceremony that would formally recognize Brennan as an adopted member of the Navajo Nation, an honor rarely bestowed upon outsiders. The ceremony took place at sunset, with representatives from multiple tribes joining the Yazzie family in recognizing the sheriff's contributions to Native American welfare. Brennan, now in his 60s with silver hair and lines carved by decades of desert sun, found himself moved to tears as the elderly woman painted traditional symbols on his face and spoke words in Navajo that needed no translation. He was being welcomed into a family that transcended blood relations, bound instead by shared sacrifice and mutual respect. As the 20th century dawned, the three friends reflected on how dramatically their world had changed since that fateful auction day in 1873. The Wild West was becoming a thing of legend rather than lived experience, preserved in dime novels and traveling shows that bore little resemblance to the harsh realities they had navigated together. Yet their friendship remained constant, a testament to bonds forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose. Sheriff Thomas Brennan died peacefully in 1907, surrounded by his family and the Yazzie sisters who had traveled from their ranch to be with him during his final days. His last words, according to witnesses, were addressed to Ayanna and Najoni. "You were never mine and I was never yours, but we were always each other's, and that made all the difference." He was buried in the Tombstone Creek Cemetery, but according to Navajo tradition, a second memorial ceremony was held at the Yazzie family burial grounds, honoring him as both a friend and a member of their extended clan. The sisters lived well into the 20th century, becoming living bridges between the old frontier world and the modern American Southwest. They witnessed the birth of Arizona as a state, the coming of automobiles and airplanes, 2 world wars, and social changes that would have been unimaginable during their years of enslavement. Throughout it all, they maintained their commitment to justice and their dedication to protecting the rights of those who couldn't protect themselves. When historians finally gained access to their private papers in the 1950s, decades after their deaths, they discovered detailed records documenting not only the Morrison conspiracy but dozens of other cases where the sisters had quietly intervened to prevent injustices or expose corruption. Their work had continued long after the dramatic events that made their friendship with Sheriff Brennan famous, proving that heroism often consists not of single dramatic gestures, but of lifelong commitments to doing what is right regardless of personal cost. The story of Sheriff Brennan and the giant Navajo sisters became part of American folklore, though like most legends, it was often simplified or distorted in the telling. Popular versions focused on the dramatic confrontations and gunfights, while missing the deeper themes of cultural understanding, institutional reform, and the power of unlikely alliances to create lasting change. The true legacy of their friendship lay not in the excitement of their adventures, but in the systematic changes they helped bring about in how different communities could learn to respect and support each other. In the end, the declaration that the Yazzie sisters made on that auction day in 1873, "We are yours forever," proved to be both literally false and spiritually true. They never belonged to Sheriff Brennan in any legal or practical sense, but they remained connected to him and his legacy throughout their long lives. Their friendship demonstrated that the bonds forged between people of different backgrounds, when based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice, could transcend the artificial divisions that society tried to impose upon them. Today, visitors to the American Southwest can still see monuments to their remarkable partnership. The Brennan Yazzie Cultural Center in what was once Tombstone Creek preserves artifacts and documents from their collaboration, while the Freedom's Promise Ranch operates as a museum and educational facility dedicated to promoting understanding between different communities. Their story continues to inspire new generations of Americans who face their own challenges in building a more just and equitable society, proving that the courage to do what is right never goes out of style, and that true friendship can indeed last forever.